Hello and welcome to Written Words. I'm Helen, and in today's video I would like to tell you a tale of two Thomases. The two Thomases are Thomas Cooper and Thomas Miller, who grew up together in the 19th century in a town called Gainsborough in Lincolnshire, a town which I know very well. And both of these Thomases grew up to become writers. So here is their story. When the newly widowed Mrs. Cooper and her sickly 6-year-old son Thomas moved into a small house in Sailor's Alley Yard in Gainsborough in 1811, this was the beginning of a lifelong friendship. Their next-door neighbours were another single mother, Mrs. Miller, and her 4-year-old son, also called Thomas. Both women worked hard to earn a meagre living, Mrs. Cooper making boxes and Mrs. Miller sewing sacks, while the boys played together and attended the same school for a while, the new free school. The two mothers became firm friends too, and they supported each other through difficult times. In his autobiography, Cooper reminisces, Miller's mother was a widow and had to sew sacks for Brumby's factory. She worked early and late for bread for herself and her two boys, but would run in now and then at the back door and join my mother for a few whiffs at the pipe. And then away they would go again to work, after cheering each other to go stoutly through the battle of life. The two boys shared a love of reading and writing, which cemented their friendship in those early days and led them to keep in contact throughout their lives, despite eventually moving to different parts of the country and enduring many hardships. Cooper tells us, "We lived in the house in front of Sailor's Alley till January 1816, and Miller and I were more or less together daily till that time." He recounts various escapades, including an adventurous expedition to Lee to celebrate the peace of 1814, which heralded the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Papers were coloured and inscribed, and ribbons procured and flags formed, and away we went to Lee to try our fortunes. I was Wellington, and was so labelled on the front of my blue cap, and Miller was Emperor of Russia, and the other lads were named after other military or regal celebrities. Despite their humble origins, Thomas Cooper wrote that Tom and I were all for learning and excitement and for doing something to win fame. They did, in fact, each achieve a certain amount of all three of these, but the path towards that achievement was perhaps more arduous than they had probably imagined in their youthful innocence. In addition to these things, they also shared a love of nature, perhaps stemming from their childhoods spent in the woods and meadows on the banks of the River Trent. Miller's poetry and lyrical prose often describes rural scenes from the countryside around Gainsborough, frequently in a wistful tone, as he recalls his early years in the town. His poem The Spring Walk, from his collection of children's poetry, opens with this verse. "We had a pleasant walk today, over the meadows and far away, across the bridge by the water-mill, by the woodside and up the hill, and if you listen to what I say, I'll tell you what we saw today." Cooper's memoir also includes an early poem that he wrote one spring at the age of 15, while sitting on a hill above the town, from where there is a beautiful view of the town, the river, and the countryside beyond. A morning in spring. See with splendour Phoebus rise, and with beauty tinge the skies. See the clouds of darkness fly, far beyond the western sky, while the lark upsoaring sings, and the air with music rings, while the blackbird, linnet, thrush, perched on yonder thorny bush, all unite in tuneful choir, and raise the happy music higher, while the murmuring busy bee, pattern of wakeful industry, flies from flower to drain the choicest juice from sweetest vein, while the lowly cottage youth, his mind well stored with sacred truth, rises devout his thanks to pay, and hails the welcome dawn of day. Oh, that 'twere mine the happy lot to dwell within the peaceful cot, there rise each morn my thanks to pay, and hail the welcome dawn of day. As they approached youthhood, the paths of the two Thomases began to diverge. Cooper notes with disapproval that his friend was inclined to indulge in social pursuits instead of spending all of his available time on study, which was Cooper's preferred lifestyle. He was strong, handsome and proud, and was soon a favourite with all the maidens of his own rank in the town. He joined wild company that took to what some people considered to be only the playful tricks of youth, but would sober down a little now and then and call upon me and talk about poetry. Sometimes he would accompany me in a walk, but while I wanted to pursue my study as we walked, he would be venting sallies of fun or quoting Falstaff or Bottom the Weaver. I saw there was unmistakable genius in Miller, but I could not persuade him to take to real study. Soon after this, however, Miller left Gainsborough and made his way to London via Nottinghamshire, in the hopes of earning a living as a writer. He would spend the rest of his life in the capital, and did indeed write prolifically, but sadly made very little money from his writing. As a result, having worked as a basket maker in his youth, he was obliged to use these skills to supplement his income, as well as growing his own produce in order to feed his family. He was no stranger to poverty in London, just as he had been in Gainsborough, and this is a recurring theme in his writing, such as his poems The Watercress Seller and The Poor London Girl, which, like much of Dickens' writing, highlight the sorry plight of many children in Victorian London. The Watercress Seller. Now all aloud the wind and rain beat sharp upon the window pane, and though 'tis hardly light, I hear the little girl go by, who does "Fine watercresses!" cry, morning, noon, and night. I saw her pass by yesterday, the snow upon the pavement lay, her hair was white with sleet, she shook with cold as she did cry, "Fine watercresses, come and buy!" and naked were her feet. And with one hand so red and cold, she did her tattered bonnet hold, the other held her shawl, which was too thin to keep her warm, but naked left each little arm, it was so very small. Her watercresses froze together, yet she, through the cold, bitter weather, went on from street to street, and thus so goes out every day, for she can earn no other way the bread which she doth eat. Thomas Cooper remained in Gainsborough for a few more years, working as a shoemaker, studying, teaching and preaching. Eventually, though, he too left the town, going first to Lincoln and then on to Leicester, where he became involved in the Chartist movement, campaigning for the rights of downtrodden workers. Unfortunately, his activism resulted in a couple of years in Stafford jail, but he emerged from prison more determined than ever to make the world a better place through his writing and speaking. The two Thomases did keep in touch during their adult life until Miller's death in 1874, and they were reunited a few times when Cooper moved to London for a while. Cooper outlived his friend by another 18 years, spending much of that time travelling around the country for speaking engagements as well as writing. He passed away in 1892 in Lincoln, where his memory lives on in the Thomas Cooper Memorial Baptist Church on the High Street. Thomas Miller, meanwhile, is commemorated by a blue plaque on Bridge Street in Gainsborough, as well as a memorial at Nottingham Castle. So that's just a brief introduction to the two Thomases and their lives. And if you're interested to know any more about the two Thomases, perhaps the best way to get to know them properly is by reading some of their writing. So, what did they write? Thomas Miller wrote over 40 books, along with many poems and articles. Some of his particularly notable works include Our Old Town, which is a beautiful description of life in a provincial town in the first half of the 19th century. Although Miller never names the town or its river or any of the surrounding villages, always referring to the place as our old town, our dreamy town, this old-fashioned town, and so on, anyone who knows Gainsborough will recognise it from the poetic, evocative descriptions, and the cast of real characters bring the history of our old town to life. Gideon Giles the Roper was probably the most popular of Miller's books during his lifetime, and it still makes for a good read today. It tells the story of a working man in provincial England, with all his trials and tribulations, loves and losses along the way. Original Poems for My Children is a collection of poetry for children, inspired by Miller's life experiences. So there are poems about nature, religion, the lives of London's poor, and the tragic true story of a young boy who was a friend of Miller's who drowned in the River Trent. Summer Morning is a lengthy poem singing the praises of a summer morning, and this poem shows off Miller's lyrical poetic style to the full. Miller also wrote a history of the Anglo-Saxons. This was a detailed study of Britain during the Anglo-Saxon period, but it's written in Miller's distinct poetic style. So those are some of Thomas Miller's works, but what did Thomas Cooper write? Although, like Miller, Thomas Cooper wrote plenty of poetry, his prose style is more direct and informative. Whereas Miller was writing to entertain, Cooper was writing to inform. So some of his works of interest include The Life of Thomas Cooper by himself. This is Thomas Cooper's autobiography, written in his older age. Cooper describes his childhood in Gainsborough, including many anecdotes from his friendship with Thomas Miller, followed by his experiences in Lincoln, Leicester and London, and his time in Stafford Jail. He explains how he became involved in the Chartist movement, his experiences in prison, and his religious journey. The Baron's Yule Feast is a novel in verse, telling the story of a rather lively Christmas celebration in Torksey, a small village near Gainsborough. Rather like the Canterbury Tales, it's a collection of different stories told by the revellers at the feast, and the River Trent plays a significant role too. Alderman Ralph was Cooper's attempt at writing a Chartist novel, inspired by the success of Charles Kingsley's novel Alton Locke. Wise Saws and Modern Instances and Purgatory of Suicides were 2 volumes of poetry which Cooper worked on whilst in prison. There are also several volumes of sermons by Thomas Cooper, as he spent a lot of time as a travelling preacher. I hope you found something of interest in that little tale of 2 Thomases, and maybe it's piqued your interest enough to take a look at some of their work at some point. If you are interested in the work of Thomas Miller, I did make a video some time ago of a walk around Gainsborough with some extracts from his book Our Old Town. And in my next video, I am going to share some of Thomas Miller's poetry too. So there is a link below to my earlier video, and do watch this space for the poetry one too. So thank you very much for joining me in this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. And in the meantime, happy reading and happy writing.